Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is a Photography 101 episode talking about optical or digital image stabilization. What is it? And do we want it? Do we need it? That's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing that you need to know is that anytime that you hold a camera, you're shaking a little bit. You might not even be aware of it, but you are. And that shaking transmits to the camera. It starts shaking too. And when you take a picture, you're taking a picture that's shaking, and that can result in a blurry image. This is especially evident when you're using slow shutter speeds, because what happens is the lens is open for a long time, and so there's more time for things to shake and things get really blurry. It's also evident when you use a very long telephoto lens, because, if you use my pen as an example, if I'm shaking here, the movement here, short focal length, is not nearly as much as the movement here if I'm using a long focal length. So long focal lengths also can make a little bit of shaking very much more significant and give you a blurry image. So there's practices that photographers used before image stabilization was around. Some of those were just good photography practices. Like they brace their legs, they hold the camera close to their body, and they would take a picture, really making themselves as stable as possible. You could also use very expensive lenses called fast glass. These lenses would allow in a lot of light, so you didn't have to leave the shutter open as long, and by using fast glass, you could sometimes eliminate blur. There's a rule with lenses called the Reciprocal Rule, and that says that you should shoot no slower than the reciprocal of the focal length that you're shooting at. So if I'm shooting at 50 millimeters, I should shoot no slower than 1/50th of a second. If I'm shooting with a telephoto lens at 200 millimeters, I should shoot no slower than 1/200th of a second. Now that's not always practical. And what do you do then? Well, what photographers could do is they could use a tripod, because a tripod doesn't move at all. So none of that body movement would be transmitted into the camera and into the photograph, and you'd be all set. Unfortunately, a lot of places don't allow tripods, and you're certainly not going to carry a tripod around if you go to a party or someone's house and you take some pictures. So this is where optical and regular or digital image stabilization comes in. Optical image stabilization is the best stabilization, and what happens there is there are sensors that are either in the lens body or in the camera body that can register movement. And when they sense movement, they can employ countermeasures either in the lens or in the camera body that kind of negate that movement. So if I'm shifting this way, the lens element might shift that way a little bit, and the net result is zero, so I'm not shaking at all. Different camera manufacturers use different terms for image stabilization. So Nikon calls it vibration reduction. I think Canon calls it image stabilization. Panasonic calls it mega OIS, etc., etc., etc. But they're all pretty much the same thing. However, certain manufacturers will typically use either one form of optical stabilization or another. So cameras like Nikon and Canon DSLRs tend to put their image stabilization in their lens. The advantage of this is that the stabilization can be completely customized to that particular lens, which means that it may perform better under certain circumstances like low light. Other manufacturers like Pentax and Sony and Olympus tend to put their image stabilization in the camera body. And instead of having a lens element shift, the sensor itself will actually shift a little bit and compensate for small movement. This offers the advantage that pretty much any lens that you put on that camera, even an old lens, will become stabilized. The other nice thing about this technology is that, let's say you've invested a lot in lenses, you get a new camera body, it's going to have the latest, greatest image stabilization in that camera body, and it's a lot cheaper to replace a camera body than it is a whole bunch of lenses. So there might be some advantages to that. But pretty much you're stuck with whatever system you use. That's what you're going to have to use, whether it's in the lens or whether it's in the body. And by the way, even though the sensor is shifting, that's still a form of optical stabilization because the sensor is the final piece in the optical light path that comes into the camera. Some cheap cameras use what's called digital stabilization, which really just means that they bump up the ISO or the film speed a bit, and they bump up the shutter speed a bit, making it less blurry because the shutter's only open for a shorter amount of time. However, the problem with this is that if the ISO is pushed too high, you might get a noisy, kind of grainy, lack of detail picture. But maybe it's better than nothing. There are some digital technologies now that will take multiple pictures in rapid succession, and then the processing chip within the camera actually will put them together in a way to reduce blurring and noise. So that's another form of digital stabilization that you can see on some cameras. So what's the advantage of having this stabilization? Well, let's say you had a camera or a lens that offered a 3-stop advantage. And let's say we're using that 200 millimeter telephoto lens. Now the normal rule would say that you should shoot no slower than 1/200th of a second, otherwise you risk getting blurry pictures. But if you go from 200 down one stop, you're down to 1/100th of a second. Go down that second stop, you're down to 1/50th of a second. Go down to that next stop, you're now down to 1/25th of a second. That's a lot of headroom. Now you have a 1/25th exposure, a lot more practical for many different situations. It's very important to realize that image stabilization only stabilizes camera movement. It has nothing to do with freezing action. So let's say I go to my son's soccer game and I want to take some pictures. Well, I would have to use a shutter speed of, let's say, 1/250th of a second or even faster to freeze action. Optical image stabilization has nothing to do with that person running on the field. They're moving. They can't compensate for that. It's just for my own personal movement. If I had to shoot at let's say in dark light condition, I just would have to use a faster lens or open my aperture up more to compensate for that fast shutter speed. So I hope this explanation tells you a little bit about image stabilization, the difference between optical, which is better, and digital, which is typically considered inferior, and why you want it on your camera. So with that, I'd say have a wonderful day, and if you have some time, please give my podcast a listen. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. It's on iTunes, and bye.